Okay. Tonight I want to talk about the animal rights movement moving backwards. I mean, look, the reality is if you're into the large corporate welfarist organizations, you might not like some of the things I'm going to say, which is fine. And we can discuss those things. But I just ask you to listen with an open mind. And, you know, if you disagree, you disagree, but let's talk about why you disagree during the Q&A session. I got involved with this in the early 1980s. I had been a vegetarian in 1978 when I went to a slaughterhouse while I was in law school. And I stopped eating meat. A year later, I read an article about fish being sentient, so I stopped eating fish. I did not know what a vegan was. I'd never heard the word vegan. I became a vegan in 1982 and got involved with the animal movement about then, about fall of 1982. And so I've been doing this for a while now. And in the 1980s and up to the early 1990s, there were two things that characterized the animal rights movement. One was this idea that we had to reject traditional animal welfare, that the animal welfare movement was not going far enough. And that we needed to be using the language and the concepts of rights. So it was a rejection of animal welfare, and it was also this notion that we needed to move in the direction of abolishing animal exploitation altogether, or at the very least substantially reducing the numbers of animals that were exploited. Different people had different views. And you know, you have to remember, back then, we were talking about animal rights, but really in many ways we didn't know what that meant and where we would go. And unfortunately, where the movement has gone is it's gone from a rejection of welfare and an acceptance of the idea that we need to abolish animal exploitation, or at least substantially reduce it, to an embrace of traditional animal welfare. Basically, animal welfare takes the position that non-humans are of lesser moral value than humans. All right? And it takes the position that as long as we provide animals with a reasonably pleasant life and a relatively pleasant death, we satisfy our moral obligations to them. That's basically the position of animal welfare. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of the animal welfare movement. Animal welfare goes back to the early 1800s in Britain. Up to that point, it's very, very interesting in terms of the history of ideas. Up to that point, animals were excluded completely from the moral and legal community. They were regarded as things that had no moral value whatsoever. In a fairly short period of time, late 1700s, early 1800s in Britain, the paradigm shifts dramatically and people start recognizing that animals do have moral value and that we have moral obligations that we owe directly to animals. Okay? Where does this come from? Well, it's complex because it came as a result of, there were a lot of progressive social movements at that time. There was opposition to human slavery. There was a concern about the rights of children. There were concerns about women not being able to vote and things of that. So there were all these progressive social movements, and as part of these progressive social movements, people started talking about non-human animals. There were a number of them. The person who probably has the greatest prominence is Jeremy Bentham, who was a lawyer and a philosopher who wrote a great deal, including a book called The Principles of Morals and Legislation, in which he has this quote that Bentham argued that although a full-grown horse or dog is more rational, more able to communicate than a human infant, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer. What Bentham basically said is because animals can suffer, that fact alone means that we have a moral obligation to not make them suffer unnecessarily. Now, did this mean that Jeremy Bentham stopped eating animals? The answer is no, it did not. Okay? It did not. Why? Because Bentham believed that animals were not self-aware, that they didn't really have a concept of their lives. So if we killed and ate them, as long as we treated them in a reasonable way, we did not harm them because they were not aware. They didn't know what we took from them when we killed them because they had no interest in continuing to live. All right? So Bentham basically says, he said, the death they suffer in our hands commonly is and always may be a speedier and by that means a less painful one than that which would await them in the inevitable course of nature. He's not recognizing that we don't find cows in the anyway, in the inevitable course of nature. We should be the worse for their living, and they are never the worse for being dead. The cow does not care that we kill and eat her. She only cares about how we treat her and how we kill her. Okay? That's what Bentham believed. Now, that was the beginning of the animal welfare movement. As a result of acceptance of these ideas that Bentham and John Stuart Mill and Humphrey Primat and a whole bunch of other people articulated, we started getting animal welfare laws. You know, that you had to do this humanely, you had to do that humanely, and and this is where animal welfare came from. Now you can say, well, wait a minute, that's crazy. How can people think that animals don't care that we kill them as long as we treat them all right, that they don't have an interest in continuing to live? Interestingly, that is exactly the position that Peter Singer takes. That's exactly the position that Peter Singer takes. Okay? He takes the position that animals do not have an interest in continuing to live, that if we kill them, killing them is not harming them per se, because if they don't have an interest in continuing to live, killing them does not harm them because you're not taking an interest from them. They don't have an interest in continuing to live. So therefore, killing them does not harm them per se. So Singer says things like, while self-awareness, the capacity to think ahead, have hopes and aspirations for the future, the capacity for meaningful relations with others and so on, are not relevant to the question of inflicting pain. What he means by that is, if I'm not self-aware, that's not relevant to the issue of inflicting pain. If I can feel pain, it doesn't matter whether I have future hopes or whether I have memories. I can feel pain now, and so therefore my lack of self-awareness is irrelevant to the imposition of pain. However, he goes on to say, it is not arbitrary to, he says, these capacities are relevant to the question of taking life. It is not arbitrary to hold that the life of a self-aware being capable of abstract thought, planning for the future, or complex acts of communication, and so on, is more valuable than the life of a being without these capabilities. So basically, he's saying that the life of a being who is not self-aware is not worth as much as the life of an individual who is self-aware. Okay? So he's basically saying animals are not as morally valuable as humans. They have lesser moral value because they are incapable of complex acts of communication. They don't use symbolic communication, what we call our language. They are unable to form beliefs about the future. They don't have memories of the past. I mean, I have to tell you, I find this profoundly wrong. As an empirical matter, I live with 6 rescued dogs. They're all abuse. Well, 5 of them are abuse cases. One came from a tragic situation, but not an abuse situation. And it is remarkable to me that anybody would say that animals are incapable of having future beliefs, or that they don't have memories, or that they don't have an interest in continuing to live. But anyway, let's go on for a second. This is Singer. This is from Animal Liberation. Okay? This is from Animal Liberation. An animal may struggle against a threat to its life even if it cannot grasp that it has a life, in the sense that requires an understanding of what it is to exist over a period of time. But in the absence of some form of mental continuity, it is not easy to explain why the loss to the animal killed is not, from an impartial point of view, made good by the creation of a new animal who will lead an equally pleasant life. Okay? This is the father of the animal rights movement, which explains in a way about why we're in the mess that we're in. Because what has happened from the early 1990s to now is the movement, which is basically a group of corporate welfare organizations. The movement has embraced Singer's view. There are no large organizations that don't promote Singer. None, not one. Okay? They all basically promote Singer's views. And Singer's views, Singer talks about the great apes, for example, because he thinks that because the great apes are more human-like, then using them and killing them may present a greater moral problem because they're self-aware. And he has talked about maybe elephants and maybe dolphins. But with respect to the animals we routinely exploit, he believes they are not self-aware. And so that our primary obligation is to lessen their suffering in our exploitation of them. This is just one of the, I could give you Singer quotes endlessly, but I will not. You could say it's wrong to kill a being whenever a being is sentient or conscious, which I maintain it is. Then you would have to say it's just as wrong to kill a chicken or a mouse as it is you or me, which I believe. I can't accept that idea. It may be just as wrong, but millions of chickens are killed every day. I can't think of that as a tragedy on the same scale as millions of human beings killed. What is different about humans? Humans are forward-looking, and they have hopes and desires for the future. That seems a plausible answer to the question of why it's so tragic when humans die. Okay? This is Singer. This has been embraced by all of the large corporate welfare charities. All of them basically accept this view. In 2005, something very important happened. Singer got all of these organizations, Animal Rights International, PETA, Farm Sanctuary, Humane Society of the United States, Mercy for Animals, Vegan Outreach, Viva, Northwest in Defense of Animals, a whole bunch of these organizations, to send a letter to John Mackey. John Mackey is the CEO of a corporation called Whole Foods. It's a chain of high-end markets, supermarkets, which sell happy meat and cage-free eggs and wonderfully happy milk and, you know, whatever. And Singer wrote a letter to Mackey, which was on the Whole Foods website for about 2 years, with all of these organizations expressing appreciation and support for the happy exploitation standards that Whole Foods was in the process of developing. Okay? This was in 2005. It was, in my judgment, this was the beginning of the end. This was really, what was happening through the 90s was there was a continual drift back. Okay, there was a continual drift back to animal welfare, but most of the organizations were somewhat embarrassed by it. And they wanted to say, no, we're not supporting animal. It changed in 2005. In 2005, Singer and all of them basically came out and said, we support animal welfare. This is a disaster, because what has happened in the intervening 10 or 11 years is all of the animal organizations have now partnered with institutional animal exploiters to promote the idea that there's a right way to do the wrong thing, that we can be compassionate animal exploiters. In my judgment, that is wrong. It is nonsense. All right, now, let me explain why, the reasons why I think this is wrong. I believe that the theory that only humans are self-aware is blatantly speciesist. Why? Because it assumes that the only sort of awareness, or the only sort of self-awareness that counts morally, is what we have as normal adults. Okay? We can look in the mirror, we recognize ourselves. Okay? We can think autobiographically. Does that mean we're self-aware? Of course it means we're self-aware. But is that the only way of being self-aware? And the answer is no, of course not. Let's think about this for a second. Okay? First of all, I think as an empirical matter, animals do have future beliefs and they do have past memories. I think that that's clearly, and I believe there's lots of research to show that. However, let's assume that non-humans live in what Singer thinks of as an eternal present, that they're just stuck in the moment. They don't think about the future. They don't think about the past. They only think about the present moment in which they are in. They are basically in an eternal present. Let's think about that for a second. Let's assume that's true. There are some humans who are in an eternal present. There's certain forms of amnesia. Okay, there are certain forms of amnesia where people are unable to form beliefs about the future, and they are unable to remember anything about the past. They are literally stuck in an eternal present. Consciousness, just a series of linked moments of consciousness. Now, does that mean they're not self-aware? And the answer is no, that doesn't mean that they're not self-aware. It means that, it means that they're self-aware in a different way. Is that difference morally relevant? And the answer is yes, of course it's morally relevant. For certain purposes, if George Brown College is looking to hire a history professor, it would not be a good idea to hire somebody who has a form of amnesia that makes that person unable to think about the past or unable to think about the future. That would be morally relevant if the question is, who do we hire to teach history? If the question is, who do we use as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor, it is completely irrelevant. Okay? Because the person who has got amnesia is aware of herself or himself in each second. So there is a perception. The person I have talked with people who have transient global amnesia. And it's fascinating. They literally cannot form a belief about what they're going to do in 5 seconds. They don't remember what they did yesterday, but they have a sense of themselves right then. If you say to them right then, "Excuse me, is it all right if I take your kidney and your liver and your heart?" They would say no. No, because they want to get to the next second of consciousness. So even if animals are stuck in an eternal present, which I do not believe empirically is the case, even if they are, that would still not mean that they're not self-aware. Okay? And so I think this idea that Singer has, and that is really sort of bought into by most of the animal welfare, most of the quote animal advocates, is that really killing isn't the problem. The problem is suffering. Is suffering a problem? Sure, it's a problem. But isn't it interesting that an animal stuck in a trap will gnaw off the animal's paw, which is very painful. Try that sometime. Try sort of biting into your wrist, okay? Really hard. And I mean, don't do it now, because Ecorazzi might have liability, and I don't want that to happen. An animal will chew off his or her paw to get out of a trap, will endure enormous amounts of pain. Why? Because that animal wants to live. It doesn't, in order to say you have an interest in life, doesn't mean you have to be able to think, I have a life, and next year I'm going to go on a vacation, I'm going to Sweden, and last year I went to Nicaragua. I mean, that's one way of being self-aware. And it's one way of thinking about the life that you have, but it's not the only way. And to say that a sentient being, i.e. a being who is subjectively aware, to say that that being does not have an interest in life is absurd. Sentience is nothing more than a means to the end of continued survival. To say that a sentient being does not have an interest in continuing to live is like saying that a being with eyes does not have an interest in continuing to see. Sentience is a characteristic which we use to survive, which we use to continue to live, and which every being who is sentient uses to continue to live. So this idea that you can be sentient but not have an interest in continuing to live, or that the only animals who have an interest in continuing to live are non-human great apes, or elephants, or dolphins, or whatever, but forget about the chickens, forget about the cows, forget about the pigs, forget about the fish, forget about all of the animals we routinely exploit, is, in my judgment, species is nonsense. So the basic premise that animals, that there's a fundamental difference between humans and non-humans that mean that their life has a lesser moral value than our lives, is fundamentally flawed, is fundamentally speciesist. There's no justification for that belief other than saying members of different species don't count as much as we do. Okay. Second reason, because animals are property, animal welfare regulation is a disaster. Remember something, animals are property, you know? I mean, I love my dogs. I don't regard them as members, as a property. I regard them as members of my family. But you know what? As far as the society is concerned, as far as the legal system is concerned, they are property. If I value them at zero, I can take them to a shelter and dump them tomorrow and say, kill them. You don't find a home for them, kill them. I can take them to a veterinarian and say, kill my dog. Because it's my property. If I wish to value my property high, I can value my property high. I can say, I regard these dogs, my property, as members of my family. Just as I can decide to take better care of my car, I can wax my car every week. Okay? That's my property. If I choose to do that, I can do it. If I just want to, keep my car in basic repair so that I can get through the inspection every year, I can do that as well, because that's what it means to be a property owner. Okay? That's what it means to be a property owner. I own my dogs. You have dogs, cats, birds, rabbits, whatever you've got, they're your property. You wish to value them at zero, you may. That is what it means to be a property owner. So animals have interests, but it costs money to protect their interests. So if you've got chickens or pigs or cows, the more interest protection that you give them, the higher the cost is. So, could you raise animals in a much better way? And the answer is yes, it'd be more expensive. And so you're dealing with billions and billions of animals. We kill 60 billion land animals and 1 trillion sea animals every year. Trillion is a million. I mean, those numbers are mind-boggling. 60 billion land animals a year. Mind-boggling. Okay? And so we've got markets, international markets in these creatures. We sell them. We sell hog futures and we sell animal futures on the stock markets. These are things that have no inherent intrinsic value. They only have extrinsic, external value. Okay? They have no value except economic value. It costs money to protect their interests, and we generally only protect their interests when we get a benefit, and that most of the time that benefit is a financial benefit. Animal welfare does nothing more than to ensure that we exploit animals in an economically efficient way. Let me give you an example. This was actually, I wrote a whole book on this in the mid-90s called Animals, Property, and the Law, where I looked at animal welfare regulation that in both Britain and the United States, and I concluded that in most cases, in almost all cases, animal welfare reform made animal exploitation more economically efficient. Let me give you an example. 1958 Humane Slaughter Act in the United States, which required large animals, cows, pigs, sheep, to be stunned before they are shackled, hoisted, and cut. If you look at the legislative history behind the 1958 Humane Slaughter Act, what you see is Congress expressing the concern that animals who are not stunned when they're slaughtered move around a lot. And what happens when animals move around a lot? They hit workers, and they cause worker injuries. And the other thing that happens is they incur carcass damage. Because they're moving around, because they're panicked, because, basically, I don't know however many of you have been in a slaughterhouse. How many of you have been in a slaughterhouse? Okay, so not very many of you. They're horrible places. But if you've got a cow, when you put a chain around a cow's back leg and you hoist her up, what happens is, the first thing that happens is her pelvis breaks. You're talking about like a 2,000-pound animal, right? And so you hang her upside down and her pelvis breaks. She's in a lot of pain. She's moving around a lot. Okay? And so she's hitting workers, she's struggling like crazy, she's causing worker injuries, and she's incurring carcass damage. And when that carcass is damaged, the economic value of the meat is lessened. So Congress says, look, these animals are suffering needlessly, and there are worker injuries, and there is carcass damage, so we're going to require that the animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. Now, in reality, in a lot of slaughterhouses, the animals are not unconscious when they're cut and when they're skinned and when their hooves are cut off. They're stunned so that they're not moving. For example, with a pig, you've got to keep those. They use different methods. With cows, they use captive both stunning devices. With pigs, it's a real problem because pigs, they use an electric device which basically goes on the temples, and you have to keep that thing on the pig's head for a fairly long period of time before the animal's going to be unconscious through the entire slaughtering process. And what they generally do, or what they often do, is they touch the electrodes, and so the pig gets a zap of electricity. Pig falls over, and then they start the slaughtering process. So when the pig is hanging upside down, the pig is becoming, the pig is quite conscious. The pig is just immobilized in the same way that you'd be immobilized if you had been tasered or something like that. So if you come to the United States, we have police departments all over who will gladly taser you. But in any event, the thing is that interestingly, go and read. You don't believe me? Go to my website, abolitionistapproach.com. Sorry, abolitionistapproach.com. And I have the documents from PETA and the Humane Society, because they're now arguing that chicken producers ought to gas chickens rather than use the hideous way of killing them that they use now. And what is the argument that PETA's making? PETA's saying that there's a lot of carcass damage that is caused by the present method of slaughtering chickens, and that you'll cut down on the carcass damage. There are worker injuries, because even though chickens moving around don't cause the sort of injury that cows hanging upside down moving around cause, there's still a lot of worker injuries, because there's blade going all the time, there's hot water for the defeathering, there's an electric bath that's supposed to render them unconscious, so there's electricity, there's water, there's knives, there's hot water, there's a lot of worker injuries in slaughterhouses, in chicken slaughterhouses. So the argument is, look, you can do this more efficiently. You can actually increase the production efficiency of exploitation by gassing them rather than using the method that is used now. That's what animal welfare is. It's working with industry to make industry more efficient. All of the welfare reforms are things that will happen anyway. And this is actually one of the interesting things. If you look, for example, at Europe, the fact that now in Europe, basically, the veal crate is pretty much phased out. Why? Because they figured out that when you've got a calf tethered in a crate, and that calf can't interact with others, they're mammals. They're just like us. They like social interaction, okay? And so if those animals can't have social interaction, they get stressed. When they get stressed, they get sick. You've got to keep those animals alive for 6 months for veal calves until you can get them to slaughter. So to the extent they get sick, you've got to spend money on veterinarian fees. So what has happened in Europe? What's happened in Europe is they've taken the veal calves out of the crates, and they have them in these little tiny, horribly small, but they can touch each other. They can nuzzle each other. They can put their faces next to each other. They can lick each other. Okay? And so as a result, the veterinary costs go down. And at the same time, everybody says, hey, I feel better about eating veal. Veal was actually one of the things that in the 1990s, people said, I don't want to eat veal. Frankly, I always thought that was crazy. There's no difference between veal and anything else. But people said, veal is really horrible. But so people stopped eating veal. Now people are eating veal again. Because they say, they're not raising it that way. The veal consumption in Europe as a result of getting rid of the veal crate has gone up. Okay? So these welfare measures are things that would happen anyway. And what ends up happening is you have these large animal organizations, they sit around, they look at economically vulnerable practices. Because they read the economic agricultural journals, they identify economically vulnerable practices, they go after them because they're on their way out anyway. Farrowing crates for pregnant pigs, they're on their way out. There are other ways of dealing with pregnant pigs which are much more economically efficient, like electronic sow feeding, for example. Much more efficient. The whole industry is moving in this direction. Meanwhile, the animal people are saying, we've got great victories, we've got them to change. They didn't get them to change. All that's happened is what was going to happen anyway, because it's economically efficient. And then the animal people are busy saying, we've got a great victory, give us a donation. It is complete nonsense. Okay? The bottom line is animal welfare standards, because animals are property, will generally do little, if anything more, than make animal exploitation more efficient.